It all started with the Battle of Manzikert. The Battle of Manzikert was fought between the Byzantine Empire and the Seljuk Empire on the 26th of August 1071 near Manzikert. The decisive defeat of the Byzantine army, also known as the Eastern Roman Empire, and the capture of Emperor Romanos IV Diogenes played an important role in undermining Byzantine authority in Anatolia and Armenia, and allowed for the gradual Turkification of Anatolia. Many of the Turks, who had been during the 11th century traveling westward, saw the victory at Manzikert as an entrance to Asia Minor. In March 1095, Pope Urban II received an ambassador from the Byzantine Empire, Alexios Komnenos, asking for help against the Muslim Seljuk Turks, who had taken over most of formerly Byzantine Anatolia. A great council met, attended by numerous Italian, Burgundian, and French bishops in such vast numbers it had to be held in the open air outside of the city of Clermont. Though the Council of Clermont, held in November of the same year, was primarily focused on reforms within the church hierarchy, Urban II gave a speech on 27th of November 1095 to a broader audience. Urban's sermon proved highly effective as he summoned the attending nobility of the people to wrest the Holy Land and the Eastern churches generally from the control of the Seljuk Turks. He promised forgiveness and pardon for all of the past sins of those who would fight to reclaim the Holy Land and free the Eastern churches. The Byzantine Empire had lost Jerusalem in the siege of Jerusalem in 637. Peter the Hermit was to lead the People's Crusade. He spent time preaching the crusade to the people. This paired with a promise made by the Pope that they could be abolished of all sin if they fought this war, and you had the worst of the worst going to fight this war. Peter was able to recruit from England, Lorraine, France, and Flanders. Peter the Hermit arrived in Cologne, Germany on Holy Saturday, the 12th of April in 1906. In Germany, Peter was one of the prominent leaders of Crusaders involved in the Rhineland massacres against the Jews. That was just one of the examples of his cruelty against the people of the Jewish faith. Peter also slaughtered Jewish people in the Kingdom of Lorraine. The citizens of Cologne were also unkind to the Jewish people. They also killed a number of them as well. Peter's party also slaughtered Jewish people in Mainz. These people tried to take refuge with the bishop and paid him to try to keep them safe, but Peter's party still killed them. During the Rhineland massacre, they killed 5,000 men, women, and children. It is likely that the Crusaders were motivated by their need for money. The Rhineland communities were relatively wealthy, both due to their isolation and because they were not restricted as Catholics were against money lending. Many Crusaders had to go into debt in order to purchase weaponry and equipment for the expedition, as Western Catholicism strictly forbade usury. Many Crusaders inevitably found themselves indebted to Jewish moneylenders. Having armed themselves by assuming the debt, the Crusaders rationalized the killings of Jews as an extension of their Catholic mission. The extent of the era's anti-Semitism is apparent in Godfrey of Bouillon, who swore to go on this journey only after avenging the blood of the crucified one by shedding Jewish blood and completely eradicating any trace of those bearing the name Jew, thus assuaging his own burning wrath. In June 1096, Crusaders led by Peter the Hermit sacked Semen in Belgrade, forcing Byzantine troops to flee to Niš. July 3, 1096, Peter the Hermit's Peasants' Crusade meets Byzantine forces at Niš. Although Peter is victorious and moved towards Constantinople, about a quarter of his forces are lost. This is a clear sign that the People's Crusades are not interested in fighting alongside of the Byzantine Empire, which are their supposed allies. No, they have their own agenda, which is that of vengeance and bloodshed of the Jewish people. The Battle of Civito occurred in 1096 and brought an end to the People's Crusade. After the disastrous defeat of the Crusaders in the siege of Zary-Gordon, 2 Turkish spies spread a rumor that the German element of the People's Crusade, who had taken Zary-Gordon, had also taken Nicaea. This had the effect of causing excitement among the main camp of Crusaders to share in the looting of the city as soon as possible. The Turks were waiting on the road to Nicaea. Peter the Hermit, the nominal leader of the crusade, had gone back to Constantinople to arrange for supplies and was due back soon, and most of the leaders argued to wait for him to return, which he never did. However, Geoffrey Burrell, who had taken command, argued that it would be cowardly to wait, and they should move against the Turks right away. His will prevailed, and on the morning of October 21st, the entire army of 20,000 marched out towards Nicaea, leaving women, children, the old, and the sick behind at the camp. 3 miles from the camp, where the road entered a narrow wooded valley near the village of Trachon, the Turkish army was waiting. When approaching the valley, the Crusaders marched noisily and were immediately subjected to a hail of arrows. Panic set in immediately, and within minutes, the army was in full route back to the camp. Most of the Crusaders were slaughtered, upwards of 60,000 by some accounts. However, women, children, and those who surrendered were spared. 3,000, including Geoffrey Burrell, were able to obtain refuge in an abandoned castle. Eventually, the Byzantines under Constantine Catacollon sailed over and raised the siege. These few thousand returned to Constantinople, the only survivors of the People's Crusade. So it's very, I think, kind of important to go to the very beginning of this and understand that, the Pope had made this promise that, if they went and fought this war, that he would abolish all of their sins. And in this time frame, you have to consider their mindset. The Catholic Church was the authority of the land, and it was very much so a marriage between, the religious part of their mind and the governmental part of their mind as well. So, they were one and the same, right? The government to them was a representation of God. And so therefore, if the Pope would forgive them of their sins, then they were forgiven not only by God, but also by the state. So you've got men here. Forgive me for this holy crap background noise. Sounds like a war zone in here. You've got men that have committed horrific crimes in their life. They've done probably the worst of the worst. And now they're given the opportunity to be relieved of this. So, consider today, if you had rapists and murderers, just the worst of the worst, and now they're given an opportunity to be relieved of those sins, if you will. That's what you had. So now you've got Peter the Hermit coming out of Germany that is preaching this gospel, or whatever you want to call it, this message that they can go and go fight this war. And these people are very, very much so anti-Semitic. So when we look at the Rhineland massacre, you see there it's almost the very beginning of anti-Semitism, where they're really blaming them and the usury, because the Catholic Church would not allow anybody in this time within the Catholic Church to give money loans. Usury was, like I said, strictly forbidden within the Catholic Church, but the Jews were not held to that standard. So that was kind of the one avenue that they had to make a living, was to run the banking business. It'd be very similar to, like, in the United States, we have Indians and their preservations. They run casinos in a lot of places because legally they're allowed to do that, on their preservations, but right outside of the preservation, it may be against state law to have any kind of gambling facility like that within the state. And so you'll see a lot of these, the Indian preservations that'll do that. And that's essentially the same thing as what the Jews were doing. But the Rhinelands, as they went through, they just massacred these people. They killed women, children, everything you can think of. And then on top of that, as they move down a little farther south, they actually come across another Byzantine area here, where they're supposed to be their allies, right? They're supposed to be fighting alongside of these guys, but they were out of food, they were out of resources. So what do? They go and they wreak havoc on that area as well. And steal all their stuff. They murder them people, and these are supposed to be their allies. So you can see right off the bat, this was by no means a journey to take over the Holy Land for these men. They had no righteous battle that they were going to hopefully take back the Holy Land because they believe it genuinely belonged to the Catholic Church. It was nothing like that whatsoever. They were simply interested in abolishing their own sins. And as you'll see, their selfishness eventually is going to be the ruin of them. But that's about it for this part right here. We've got another section to come in. Before I do, Krauko's in here. Krauko, did you have any questions or anything on this little segment? Okay, no worries. I'll tell you what, we'll just queue up the next part then. Give me 1 second. The Prince's Crusade was, by comparison to the People's Crusade, a very well-organized and disciplined army. The Crusader armies crossed over into Asia Minor during the first half of 1097, where they were joined by Peter the Hermit and the remainder of his little army. The first objective of their campaign was Nicaea, previously a city under Byzantine rule, but what should become the capital of the Seljuk Sultanate under Rum under Kili Arslan. Arslan was away campaigning against the Danishmends in central Anatolia at the time, and had left behind his treasury and his family, underestimating the strength of these new crusaders. Subsequently, upon the crusaders' arrival, the city was subjugated to a lengthy siege, and when Arslan had word of it, he rushed back to Nicaea and attacked the crusader army on the 16th of May. He was driven back by the unexpectedly large crusader force, with heavy losses being suffered on both sides in the ensuing battle. The siege continued, but the crusaders had little success as they found they could not blockade the lake, which the city was situated on, and from which it could be provisioned. To break the city, Alexios sent a crusader's ships rolled over land on logs, and at the sight of them, the Turkish garrison finally surrendered on 18th of June. Now, if you're here with us in the Discord server, I want you to take a look and follow along here in this chat. I want you to look at these pictures of some illustrations here to get an idea of what they're talking about. We're talking about actually rolling ships across land on logs. This must have been quite the spectacle. This must have been really something to see. The Battle of Dorylaeum. At the end of June, the Crusaders marched on through Anatolia. They were accompanied by some Byzantine troops under Tatikios, and still harbored the hope that Alexios would send a full Byzantine army after them. They also divided the army into two more easily managed groups, one contingent led by the Normans, the other by the French. The two groups intended to meet again at Dorylaeum, but on the 1st of July, the Normans, who had marched ahead of the French, were attacked by Kali Arslan. Arslan had gathered a much larger army than he previously had after his defeat at Nicaea, and now surrounded the Normans with his fast-moving mounted archers. The Normans deployed in a tight-knit defensive formation, surrounding all their equipment and the non-combatants who had followed them along the journey, and sent for help from the other group. When the French arrived, Godfrey broke through the Turkish lines at the Legate at Hemar, outflanked the Turks from the rear. Thus the Turks, who had expected to destroy the Normans and did not anticipate the quick arrival of the French, fled rather than face the combined Crusader army. The Crusaders' march through Anatolia was thereafter unopposed, but the journey was unpleasant, and Arslan had burned and destroyed everything he left behind in his army's flight. It was the middle of summer, and the Crusaders had very little food and water. Many men and horses died. Fellow Christians sometimes gave them gifts of food and money, but more often than not, the Crusaders simply looted and pillaged whenever the opportunity presented itself. The Siege of Antioch. The Crusader army, meanwhile, marched on to Antioch, which lay about halfway between Constantinople and Jerusalem. Described by the Stephen of Blois as a city great beyond belief, very strong and unassailable, the idea of taking the city by assault was a discouraging one to the Crusaders. Hoping rather to force the capitulation or find a traitor inside the city, a tactic that had previously seen Antioch change to the control of the Byzantines and then the Seljuk Turks. The Crusader army set Antioch to siege on 20 October 1097. During the almost 8 months of the siege, they were forced to defeat 2 large relief armies under the leadership of Dalkuk and Falkar al-Mulk Radwan. Antioch was so large that the Crusaders did not have enough troops to fully surround it, and as a result it was able to stay partially supplied. On the 4th of March 1098, relief arrived in the form of a crusade fleet, the Saxon Crusade, bringing much-needed supplies from the west. In May of 1098, Kerboga of Mosul approached Antioch to relieve the siege. Bohemond bribed an Armenian guard named Pharaoh to surrender his tower, and in June the Crusaders entered the city and killed most of the inhabitants. However, only a few days later the Muslims arrived, laying siege to the former besiegers. According to Raymond D. Aguilers, it was at this point that a monk named Peter Bartholomew claimed to have discovered the Holy Lance in the city, and although some were skeptical, this was seen as a sign that they would be victorious. 28th of June 1098, the Crusaders defeated Kerboga in a pitched battle outside the city, a victory caused by Kerboga's inability to organize the different factions in his army. While the Crusaders were marching towards the Muslims, the Fatimid section of the army deserted the Turkish contingent, as they feared Kerboga would become too powerful were he able to defeat the Crusaders. According to Christian eyewitnesses, an army of Christian saints came to the aid of the Crusaders during the battle and crippled Kerboga's army. Stephen of Blois, a crusade leader, was in Alexandria when he learned of the situation in Antioch. It seemed like their situation was hopeless, so he left the Middle East, warning Alexios and his army on his way back to France. Because of what looked like a massive betrayal, the leaders at Antioch, most notably Bohemond, argued that Alexios had deserted the crusade and thus invalidated all of their oaths to him. While Bohemond asserted his claim to Antioch, not everyone agreed, most notably Raymond. So the crusade was delayed for the rest of the year while the nobles argued amongst themselves. Meanwhile, a plague broke out, killing many among the army, including the legate Adhemar, who died on the 1st of August. There were now even fewer horses than before, and worse, the Muslim peasants in the area refused to supply the Crusaders with food. Thus, in December, after the Arab town of Marat al-Numam was captured along the siege, history describes the first occurrence of this cannibalism among the Crusaders. Radolf of Caen wrote, "In Mararat, our troops boiled pagan adults in cooking pots. They impaled children on spits and devoured them grilled." At the same time, the minor knights and soldiers had become increasingly restless and threatened to continue to Jerusalem without their squabbling leaders. Finally, at the beginning of 1099, the march restarted, leaving Bohemond behind as the first prince of Antioch. Well, this puts a really big dent in all these movies where we always see the gallant knights and these people that are just so, holy and Catholic. It really puts a big dent in that, and it's just another one of these stories. Whenever you look back in history, you just see the nature of human, man, just the nature of humankind to just be absolutely brutal in everything that we do. I mean, it's disgusting, really. But even this was supposed to be the prince's crusade. I mean, this was supposed to be the organized army that would go with discipline. This was supposed to be the people that would go and do things the right way. And even they are pillaging, cities and towns. They're just as bad as Peter the Hermit's People's Crusade was. The very unorganized sort of, if you will, around the U.S. time or anything, like the rednecks. Those were those guys. But this is supposed to be the organized group, and they're just as bad. I mean, they're slaughtering people everywhere they go, pillaging towns. I mean, look how bad this is. I mean, listen, they're cooking children and stuff. I mean, it's just absolutely sick, man, what goes on here. But what is interesting, though, is that all hope is almost lost. And what we're going to find out, this actually ties into what we're going to find out in the later episodes with the Knights of the Templar is that relics were really big with them. This really had a lot of weight in them. Is the relics, and this right here was all it took. They found a relic, and it was enough to lift their spirits. Now, this is just some small inanimate object. So, like when we're talking about the Holy Grail or something like that, right? But it's not just the Holy Grail. I mean, it can be anything that they thought might have in some way been related to Christ in his time frame, because in their mind, when they had these relics and they were symbolic in some way to when Christ was on earth, it was their way, they thought, to touch God. It was through this inanimate object that they could touch God. Now, what's fascinating about this is that even so, you look at what these men are physically willing to do, and how much of an impact it has on their spirit and their body and their minds when they just find this inanimate object that they think somehow or other they can touch God, yet less, whether you're a Christian or not, you have to find the irony in this, that it says in the Bible not to worship false idols. And there they are, just, literally worshiping an inanimate object, enough to completely take them out of despair in such a, they're starving, kind of half dead, and this inanimate object's enough to get them really hyped up and ready to go into Jerusalem, because they're getting ready now to kind of the final battle right here in Jerusalem. Just like in a movie, they've made it through the long journey. They're tired as can be. Now they've made it to Jerusalem, and they're looking at Jerusalem like, how are we even going to do this? How are we going to get in here? How are we possibly going to be able to get through those walls and take this thing over? And that's kind of where their mind and their body was at. It's just quite an interesting story. So, Krauko or anybody, do y'all have any questions on this little section here?
Well, I do have some input, I guess, here, because I really see how this is like a really prolonged war, and how it really gave way to a lot of these like these bad things happening, of like cannibalism and skirmishes everywhere. And I think when you look back at it, it really has to do a lot with the that this war was kind of an overreach of their power. Don't you think?
Overreach of the Catholic Church's power, you mean?
Yeah. I mean, it's the church saying like, "Oh, just go there and do it," but in reality, the actual logistics of actually getting it done is just incredibly difficult, because they don't know how to. They don't have nearly enough food for it all, and they don't have the resources. They don't have the materials and the methods for it. Like, that's what I found really odd about this.
Well, at the very beginning, they were supposed to be allying with the Byzantine Empire, so they were really relying on them to help them out. And so the Pope had saw this and said, well, this is kind of the golden opportunity here, because the Byzantine Empire wants to ally with us and work with us to come in and take Jerusalem. So the Pope saw this as a grand opportunity to go and take Jerusalem. But as this went on, a lot of the leadership, they were really bickering back and forth. A lot of the guys did not want to wait when they were in Antioch. They didn't want to sit and wait. They thought we need to go right now. And they were just bickering back and forth. And so you had a massive amount of people that had originally started ended up just going back home, that gave up. So now we're here at Jerusalem, and they're definitely overextended. They're not prepared for this at all. They don't have the supplies, the effort, the manpower. They're really undermanned, hungry, probably tired, thirsty, everything you can imagine. But yeah, so nevertheless, yeah, I think you're dead on there, though. Even just looking at the power of the Catholic Church, and to say, let's just send them and see what happens. I think that was probably why they led off with the People's Crusade. I think they said, well, let's just, make this promise, and we'll just send the measly peasants out there and see if they get it done. If they don't get it done, then we'll send the big troops. And the big troops went out and they sucked too, so.
Mm-hmm. Should have just sent them all at one go. Maybe that'll work, but doing it like this definitely didn't.
Well, we're about to get into it, I guess. Let's dig into this last part here, because now we're about to look at the final battle. This is going to be the Siege of Jerusalem. We'll dig into this and see what happens. The Siege of Jerusalem. Crusaders' arrival at Jerusalem revealed an arid countryside, lacking in water or food supplies. Here there was no prospect of relief, even as they feared an imminent attack by the local Fatimid rulers. There was no hope of trying to blockade the city, as they had at Antioch. The Crusaders had insufficient troops, supplies, and time. Rather, they resolved to take the city by assault. They might have been left with little choice, as by the time the Crusader army reached Jerusalem, it had been estimated that only about 12,000 men, including 1,500 cavalry, remained. These contingents, composed of men with different origins and varying allegiances, were also approaching another low ebb in their camaraderie. While Godfrey and Tancred made camp to the north of the city, Raymond made his to the south. In addition, the provincial contingent did not take part in the initial assault on the 13th of June. This first assault was perhaps more speculative than determined, and after scaling the outer wall, the Crusaders were repulsed from the inner one. After the failure of the initial assault, a meeting between the various leaders was organized, in which it was agreed upon that a more concerted attack would be required in the future. And on the 17th of June, a party of Geno's mariners under Guglielmo Umbriaco arrived at Jaffa and provided the Crusaders with skilled engineers and, perhaps more critically, supplies of timber stripped from the ships to build siege engines. The Crusaders' morale was raised when a priest, Peter Desiderius, claimed to have had a divine vision of Bishop Adamir, instructing them to fast and then march in a barefoot procession around the city walls, after which the city would fall, following the biblical story of Joshua at the siege of Jericho. After a 3-day fast on the 8th of July, the Crusaders performed the procession as they had been instructed by Desiderius, ending on the Mount of Olives, where Peter the Hermit preached to them, and shortly afterward, the various bickering factions arrived at a public reapproachment. News arrived shortly after that a Fatimid relief army had been set off from Egypt, giving the Crusaders a very strong incentive to make another assault on the city. The final assault on Jerusalem began on the 13th of July. Raymond's troops attacked the south gate, while the other contingents attacked the northern wall. Initially, the Provincials at the southern gate made little headway, but the contingents at the northern wall fared better, with a slow but steady attrition of the defense. On the 15th of July, a final push was launched at both ends of the city, and eventually the inner rampart of the northern wall was captured. In the ensuing panic, the defenders abandoned the walls of the city at both ends, allowing the Crusaders to finally enter. The massacre that followed the capture of Jerusalem has attained particular notoriety as a juxtaposition of extreme violence and anguished faith. The eyewitness accounts from the Crusaders themselves leave little doubt that there was great slaughter in the aftermath of the siege. Nevertheless, some historians propose that the scale of the massacre has been exaggerated in later medieval sources. After the successful assault on the northern wall, the defenders fled to the Temple Mount, pursued by Tancred and his men. Arriving before the defenders could secure the area, Tancred's men assaulted the precinct, butchering many of the defenders, with the remainder taking refuge in the Al-Aqsa Mosque. Tancred then called a halt to the slaughter, offering those in the mosque his protection. When the defenders on the southern wall heard of the fall of the northern wall, they fled to the citadel, allowing Raymond and his Provincials to enter the city. Iftikhar al-Dalwa, the commander of the garrison, struck a deal with Raymond, surrendering the citadel in return for being granted safe passage to the Ascalon. The slaughter continued for the rest of the day. Muslims were indiscriminately killed, and Jews who had taken refuge in their synagogue died when it was burnt down by the Crusaders. The following day, Tancred's prisoners in the mosque were slaughtered. Nevertheless, it is clear that some Muslims and Jews of the city survived the massacre, either escaping or being taken prisoner to the ransomed. The Eastern Christian population of the city had been expelled before the siege by the governor, and thus escaped the massacre. The Battle of Ascalon. The Crusaders had attempted to negotiate with the Fatimids during their march to Jerusalem, but to no avail. After the Crusaders captured Jerusalem from the Fatimids, they learned of a Fatimid army about to attack them. On the 10th of August, Godfrey of Bouillon led the remaining troops from Jerusalem to Ascalon, a day's march away. The Fatimids were estimated to have had as many as 50,000 troops. Other sources estimated about 20 to 30,000, entering the battle. Their troops consisted of Seljuk Turks, Arabs, Persians, Kurds, and Ethiopians. Opposing them were the Crusaders, whose numbers were estimated around 1,200 knights and 9,000 infantry. On the 12th of August, Crusader scouts discovered the location of the Fatimid camp, which the Crusaders immediately marched towards. According to most Crusaders and Muslim accounts, the Fatimids were caught unaware. Because of a somewhat ill-prepared Fatimid army, the battle was fairly short, although it still took some time to resolve, according to Albert of Aix. Alef-Dul and his army retreated into the heavily guarded and fortified city of Ascalon. The next day, the Crusaders learned that Alef-Dul had retreated back to Egypt via boat, so they plundered what remained of the Fatimid camp. After returning to Jerusalem, most of the Crusaders returned to their homes in Europe. Only 300 Crusaders stayed in Jerusalem, leaving it vulnerable to their enemies. Will the Crusaders maintain their control over the Holy Land? Next time we're going to find out when we look into the Second Crusade. So just jumping right to the end of this, this is ironic. Not ironic, just absolutely nuts. They go through all of this, and then only 300 people stay. The rest of them just packed up and they went back home. I mean, they go through all this, they take over Jerusalem, and then they just leave. I mean, they just go in and massacre all these people. They take Jerusalem, and then they don't even care enough to stay. They just leave. What's going on? You know, these people didn't care about Jerusalem. They were something else in it for them. They could have cared less about Jerusalem. The Pope cared, the Catholic Church cared, but these people fighting this war, they could have cared less.
Yeah, I think it's mostly about the money in this one. Because if they really cared about like going to the afterlife and reaching all that holy stuff, they would have all stayed in Jerusalem, obviously.
Yeah, no doubt. I mean, if it was that symbolic to them, I mean, let's look at how symbolic they are in their mind. I mean, imagine today, you're standing outside of a city, you're ready to fight a battle, and some guy comes up and says, I'll tell you what you need to do. What you need to do is you need to walk around this city barefooted, and that's going to win the war. Oh, yeah, that's a great idea. That's what'll do it. I mean, come on, really?
I mean, if it works, it works.
Yeah, I guess. Yeah. But I mean, that's just nuts, you know. And then but it is kind of I mean, it is interesting to think about this though, because they believe that because it aligns with the story of Joshua. So in their mind, what they are about to do is biblical in its ways. I mean, they are about to perform a biblical moment that's going to be, you know, they're going to be remembered for all time as the men that. Yeah, I mean, they were remembered for all time, just probably not how they thought they were going to be.
Of course, they thought there would be the 17th book in the Bible and all that, but it's not really how it turned out.
Not at all. And then they even, you know, they went and they prayed on the Mount of Olives. They went up there and they prayed there. I mean, I can imagine how symbolic this must have been for them. Quite the moment, I'd imagine. I mean, it would definitely make for a good movie, wouldn't it? I mean, this whole thing would be quite the movie.
Yeah, I think I already have a title up in my head. Considering the last moment you described, I think a good name for it would be 300.
300, the Crusaders.
Oh, I'd love to see that. I mean, I like the ending with the little cliffhanger, but I think we all know that it's called 300 not because of the Crusaders who slayed the incoming Middle Eastern army. Yeah, Something in my gut tells me they didn't stand a chance.
Yeah, I feel like this 300 would be like the original 300 movie, but just skip all the cool stuff and just go straight to them getting slayed by arrows. That's what this is going to look
Hmm.
like more than likely.
I don't think it'll be arrows because Crusaders are known for their big, bulky metal armor. Arrows will bounce right off of it.
Well, we had a discussion about that in here not too long ago. That it turns out it's not necessarily true. I mean, generally speaking, it might, but the archers were quite they were quite good at aiming at the vulnerable spots, in between the armor. Apparently,
Oh yeah, yeah, I know that part. That's a little part I could kind of add to. It kind of depends on what kind of arrow you're using, rather than the actual part that you're aiming at. So, you're looking at these Middle Eastern guys who are using, um, well, basically like cheap iron arrowheads, and then you're looking at the Crusaders who, in this era, are mostly using chainmail, and well, the knights are also using plate armor. On on chainmail, it would hurt if it hits, but it wouldn't kill you. But on the plate armor, maybe some would get in between the bits, but even then, it wouldn't do the thing. You need quality barbed arrows to get it real done. And most of the bulk of the Arabians, they were just using cheap iron arrows, or even just wooden arrows. So
yeah, and I remember Damon was talking about actually too that the archers they were now this is kind of going back more into the Greek Roman era, but they were not necessarily trained to be archers. I mean, they were raised to be archers, and if they were
mhm.
right-handed, typically their left arm would actually be much shorter than their right arm from all the compression of holding the bow and just the pressure that they would put on from such a young age. It would actually kind of misshape their body, which made them
Yeah.
perfect for archers, but for anything else, they were pretty much useless.
Hmm. Yeah, like Zio here said too. It does have a lot to do with archer's skill, because archery is definitely an art that requires a lot of skill, which is something I'll probably go back on the old warfare book I'm writing right now. But yeah, that's definitely something to take into account.
Now, kind of get back into here though. This is another element that's also important to understand here is now they've made it into Jerusalem, right? But one thing that they have done is that before the Crusaders came through, the Turks and the Muslims were very much so divided. But as they came through, kind of the how people will unite in chaos like that. When the people are being massacred like that, they tend to unite, and that's exactly what's happening right now in this time period. Coming after the first crusade, is the Muslims and the Turks. They're really coming together. Like, hey, we all have a common enemy here, and that's what's happening right now. And now you've got like we just said, they've kind of abandoned Jerusalem. They've only left 300 soldiers there to defend Jerusalem. So it's not looking so good. But we'll get into that. We're going to do another one on the Second Crusade, then the Third Crusade, then what we're going to get into after that. I wanted to do all the Crusades to lead up to kind of the end of this. We're going to talk about the Knights of the Templar. We're going to talk about the Sheen on Parchment, and what that kind of revealed to us about the old tale of the Knights of the Templar being the satanic cult. They had to do these satanic rituals and stuff apparently to join into it. The Shinon parchment that was released by the Catholic Church clears some of that up. We're going to find out a little bit more about that and see what's myth, see what's reality. Believe it or not, there is some reality to some of those claims, but we'll get into that at a later date. So, I guess before we close the podcast out here, is there any final thoughts or questions on this?
Yeah, I only have one one last little thing, I guess. That's Deus Vult.
I'm sorry, I missed that. What was that?
Deus Vult.
What's that?
That's the Crusaders' war cry.
Oh, okay. Yeah. All right. Well, I guess that's it then. So until next time, guys, we'll catch you later. If you're checking this out on any of our platforms, YouTube, SoundCloud, or Castbox, just take a look down in the description. There's going to be a link to bring you into the Discord server here. What this is, we are a Discord server. It's called A Closer Look. It's just a group of people. It's growing every day. We all just get in here and we talk about history. It's all divided very much, so into different time frames, so you can talk about any time frame you want. You'll find somebody to sit here and chat with. So go down there, click the link, come on and say. So, without any further ado, until next time, we'll see you later, guys.